I'm John Lamole from Gemini Marine Products in Rockland, Maine, and today we're going to show you how to perform a strapless bimini conversion, starting with a standard bimini that has 4 webbing straps and ending up with a strapless bimini that has 2 rigid back legs and a pair of folding spreader bars using our patented Gemini folding struts. Here in our custom canvas shop, Gemini Marine Canvas, the strapless bimini is definitely our preferred way of building a bimini frame. The reasons are very obvious and very simple. Number 1, 4-strut design is as strong and as rigid as you can find. Number 2, if you get rid of the webbing straps, you eliminate the motorboating that occurs at various wind speeds, plus the degradation of the webbing in time and the need for replacement. And third, on aft cockpit sailboats in particular, the access in and out of the cockpit is maximized. You've eliminated any obstruction between the two, and you also eliminate the potential interference of the straps with winches and winch handles. Here are all the parts you need for one side of the strapless bimini. You need 2 eye ends, 1 strut, and 2 either split or sliding side mounts. Please bear in mind that you'll need to double all this to do the other side. Here are all the parts you'll need to make one of the rigid aft legs. The process of converting a bimini from 4 straps to strapless basically involves 2 parts. The first is replacing the aft straps with a pair of rigid struts from the bimini frame down to either the boat or the stern rail or push pit. The second stage will involve replacing the forward straps with a pair of folding spreader bars that will run between the end frames and usually parallel to the fabric edge above. In most cases, the lower end will go to the push pit or stern rail. And in that occurrence, we almost always use a split jaw slide, which will clamp to the frame, and then we prefer a toggle type drop nose quick release pin to hold the eye end in. The upper end is equally simple. You'll need either a sliding jaw slide or a split type jaw slide to secure the eye end and the top end of the tubing to the frame. Most people will prefer the split jaw slide because you don't have to disassemble any of the hardware from the frame below that. When you're installing these back legs, don't worry about getting too technical. Remember that these rigid aft legs are only supporting the weight of the frame. They're fairly passive. They're not involved in the tensioning at all. So that means that you can configure them a wide variety of ways. You can mount them fairly low on the frame if that suits you, or fairly high. You can have them be vertical or angled. You can even mount them at an angle inboard athwartships to provide a little bit of rigidity for the frame across the boat. One other small tip on figuring out the length of a strut. If you can mount the hardware on the upper end and the lower end prior to measuring and have everything set up in a very real world way, take a tape measure and insert it into the eye end socket to give yourself a really accurate estimation of the tubing's end. Here we have installed a completed pair of rigid back legs. Now, a lot of aft cockpit sailboats will already have a pair of rigid back legs used in conjunction with forward straps. If your boat's that way, then you can skip this step, but for everybody else, we're ready to go on to installing the horizontal spreader bars. We're now going to begin the installation of the folding spreader bars. For that, you'll need either a split type side mount or a sliding side mount. It's a matter of preference. The split mounts are a little more expensive, but much easier to use in that, again, you do not have to disassemble all the frame hardware below this mounting position. Most people, if they're doing retrofits, will go that way. If canvas shops are building new construction, they'll tend to use the slide fittings because they're a little cleaner, a little quieter. Whichever type of mount you use, they can be positioned facing either outboard or inboard. It makes no structural difference. Depends on the boat and handhold requirements and overall what you want to see with the finish. The first step, once you've made your decision on hardware, is to position the hardware on the frame, in most cases as high as possible and almost always parallel to the fabric's lower edge. It is possible to mount these lower rather than higher. That's fine, but they're not as powerful a lever arm mounted down low. Secondly, when you mount them up high, we think it's aesthetically a little cleaner finish because it's up near the cloth and it eliminates some of the clutter down below. Also, if you've mounted them facing inboard, you can actually push them up high, sometimes even behind the fabric, and have them disappear from view entirely. We now have the sliding side mounts, in this case, in position facing outboard. And as you can see, I've already installed the eye ends on each of the mounts, and I've positioned them in the correct line, and so that I can get a good visual on my angle and the in and out rotation of the mount on the frame. So you'll do that on both sides and have them set up to this point, but it's really important that you have the eye ends on here. The other thing that's really important is that the forward tensioning straps are still attached and that this bimini is still fully tensioned. You don't want to try and make any adjustment, any final adjustment, and you definitely don't want to try and pattern this triangle and this strut without the strap on and the bimini fully loaded. Now we're going to pattern this strut length. We're not just going to cut it to length and put it in for a very important reason. The triangle that's created by this strut and this hinge point is in most cases not symmetrical, meaning that the length from this pin up is different from the length of the pin up to here. When you fold the frame up, the completed bimini frame with the strut in place, you would now have one mount lower on the frame than the other, which means that the leg lengths of the strut, when it's in folded position, are going to be slightly different, in this case about 1.5 inches. If you haven't cut the tubing to 2 different lengths, this hinge is going to bind up as it tries to fold back, and it won't be able to fold completely, and the top will be stuck. The first step in patterning this strut is to apply a run of tape. We prefer green masking tape, but almost anything will do, from one eye end to the other, so that they're nice and taut and straight. This also gives you a chance to step back and check your line again and make sure that you have it nice and parallel, or however you want it, but it's set up the way you want it. You can see it. There's no guessing. Once you have the tape in position, the next step is to make a couple of marks on the tape on either eye end. We like to put a mark at the base of the socket, which is where you're going to have to cut the tubing, and one again just kind of for reference and to avoid confusion here at the opening of the eye end. I also like to mark port and starboard, forward and aft, just for clarity. Even though theoretically port and starboard lengths should be the same, they seldom are. Don't sweat that. If it looks good, it is good, and a great many Dodgers and Biminis are slightly off balance. So in this case, this is the starboard side, so I'll just put an S. You can write the whole word out if you want, and I'll put an arrow indicating forward. So now we know the finished length from aft to forward of the cut tubing. We don't yet know where the hinge needs to be along that length. So there's 2 steps for that. Number 1, because tape is a little bit ornery and likes to grab things, we prefer to fold the tape, stick it to itself. It makes it a little more stable. The wind won't mess with it, and it's going to be easier to handle when you fold the bimini up to try and find the centering point for the hinge. So we have that on starboard. You should at this point do the same thing on port, have both sides set up and to this stage. The next step after the tape is prepared is to release the forward straps on both sides and fold the bimini back onto its aft leg into storage position. We now have the bimini folded back onto its back leg, and we have the pattern tape ready to go on this next really important step. This pinch point where my fingers are holding the tape is where the hinge needs to be on the real world strut. So the process is as simple as this. You can see the offset in the 2 slide mounts up above, the difference in their position and how they're not next to each other. And then running back down the tape, you can see the pinch point where we need to place the hinge. The process is super simple. Just hold that tape. I usually crease it because then I have a really definite mark and I don't have to worry about holding this down under tension. And then open it up and put a line across that pinch point, and there you have it. You now have the 3 marks you need to do the final cut on a strut. You have the end cuts and the location of the hinge in the middle. So we're now at the final stage. We're going to transfer the marks from the pattern tape down to a strut that's laying here on the table. The strut is one of our assembled struts, in this case in a 6-foot length. Most Biminis will use a 6-foot strut cut down to finished length. We also sell them in 3-foot lengths, but that's usually applied to Dodgers. So at this point, we simply bring the pattern down. It doesn't matter which way, forward or aft, it's pointing unless you have a particular orientation for the spring balls, whether you want the spring balls showing on the exterior or whether you want them hidden facing on the interior. Beyond that, it doesn't matter where or how you place this onto the strut. The important thing is that you center the pinch mark on the center of the hinge. That guides everything else. Now that you have the pattern tape applied to the strut, all you have to do is mark the cut positions on either end. Again, the pinch mark is on the center of the hinge. We'll just go here to the aft end, make a couple of little ticks. To the forward end, a couple of little ticks, and then we're ready to cut the tubing. We now have the cut marks on the tubing, but before we cut, following all that ancient wisdom about checking things first, we're going to take the struts, fold them up with the pinch point, or rather with the hinge centered, and we're simply going to lay it against the eye ends to get an idea, a rough idea, whether or not the offset and the relative lengths of the halves of the strut is looking good. In this case, it's good. I think I might have mentioned earlier, if I didn't, I will now, that the strut has a little bit of overplay built into the hinge, and that's sort of a fudge factor. In case you get a little bit off, you have a little bit of slop here that you can play with and get by mistakes with. Even though we have a little bit of play based on the hinge design, once you have made your final cut and you've positioned this, you don't have a lot of latitude in moving these eye ends in their position later on to try and say tension the top a little bit more or make some other adjustment. You'll be surprised how small the difference in the placement of these eye ends and these jaw slides makes in the functioning of the strut. You don't get a lot of room, so once you get it cut, don't expect that you can shift these around and have it work out. At this stage, you should have both your struts cut, laying on the table after double checking them before cutting, laying on the table ready to install. You should have 4 eye ends already installed on the side mounts, ready to go. I'll back up just one step and urge you when you cut your tubing to use a tubing cutter as opposed to a hacksaw or some other type of blade. I'm assuming that you're doing this out on your boat and not in a machine shop, in which case a very ordinary tubing cutter. This is a plumber's version, but you can get really simple ones at Home Depot or any of the hardware stores. They make a nice clean cut, and yes, they will cut stainless just as well as anything else. So don't get up in arms about it. Just go get a simple tubing cutter. You can take care of your work right on the boat. The next step then is to take our struts, install them up into the Bimini, open it up, see how well they tension. Let's go. At this point, both the struts are now installed in the frame, both port and starboard. I've mounted one outboard and one inboard just for demonstration purposes. As I said, it doesn't affect anything structurally. Final check, the folded strut should be aligned with the frame. You can see the range of play is pretty much equal on either side. And yes, it's loose enough that when you let it go, it'll drop down. That's fine, but the important point is that as it sits, it's nicely centered on the frame itself. The next thing for us to do is to fold the Bimini out, tighten the struts up, and see how it fits. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today, and keep an eye online for future videos from Gemini Marine Products on do-it-yourself installations on a variety of new projects. Thanks.